think you will agree that the farmer is the man who feeds them all. Oh, the farmer is the man, the farmer is the man who lives on credit till the fall. Then they take him by the hand and they lead him from the land, and the middleman's the one who gets it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another fun-filled episode, APUSH Chapter 20, two-thirds of the way there, believe it or not. So we have a lot to talk about this week. And again, like I've kind of mentioned in the last two chapters, we are kind of culminating some of the ideas that we've talked about in chapters 18 and 19, and some similar ideas that we've already discussed in those chapters, and then bringing them here in chapter 20 to kind of solve or finish the discussion on the issues in American society during the Gilded Age and this progressive era. So, this should look familiar. Okay, just to jog your memory about some of the issues with American society during the Gilded Age, issues with urbanization, immigration, industrialization, the movement of people into the cities, um, the immigrants coming here and them being taken advantage of, and the rise of factories and big business owners. The progressive era needed was needed because of those issues. Now, what was it? We're going to talk a little bit more today about the government involvement in the economy and business to regulate some of these bad practices. And I mentioned this last time, the various groups of people that are involved in trying to help during this progressive era. You had church, you had politicians, you had union leaders, women, and African Americans all demanding um, their own things that they wanted, whether it be for reform in monopolies or equality, rights, things like that. Okay. Now, the progressive presidents. There are three progressive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. These three guys are going to embody what it means to reform. Okay, as we're going to find out very shortly. All three have their own part in it, and historians are always arguing over who was the most progressive out of all three. You have two Republican presidents and one Democrat, the Democrat being Wilson, and Taft and Roosevelt being Republicans. So let's talk about reform on the state level. State reform is really going to be really, I guess, embodied, if you will, for lack of a better word, once again, by Robert LaFault, who was a governor in Wisconsin. Now, he takes progressive reform on his own state, and what we're going to see are reforms like the government taking control of public utilities, like we talked about in Chapter 19, so like gas and electric and water. We talked about the positives and negatives of that last week. Also, taking control of the powerful railroads. Okay, that's something the farmers, the populists, have been trying to get the government to do for a long time. Adopt a tax reform. So this means what he is in favor of, something the populists also were in favor of, was a graduated income tax, meaning the more money you make, the more money the government takes. And then political reform, as we'll see in a second, exactly what that means. The thing about, or the reason we talk about Robert LaFault and Wisconsin is that his ideas here are going to be transplanted into other states and eventually across the entire country as national reform. So his ideas in Wisconsin, or his Wisconsin idea, are going to be absorbed by other states. So what political reform was I referring to? Some things that Robert LaFault does and other states will do and are still around today. The Australian or secret ballots. So what this means is only you, when you go to vote, only you know who you voted for. You say, okay, well, what used to happen then? So what used to happen is a lot of the times when you went to go vote in a local election, let's say I'm in New York City and I go to vote and I'm voting, for or against William the Boss Tweed. He was standing there behind the ballot box, looking to see who I voted for. Because if I vote against him, he's probably going to use that against me and maybe get my job taken away from me or my home, my house. So secret ballots ensures that people aren't taken advantage of, and obviously you can vote fairly. You're not intimidated by the politician. Direct primary. So this means that us, the voters, choose the candidates to become primary candidates. So just for example, we had primaries in 2020. Each party selected a candidate to run for president. The Republicans chose Donald Trump, and the Democrats chose Joe Biden. Now, we, the voters, we chose that. We voted in every state on who would be the primary candidate to um, represent that party. Back in the day, in the 1800s, a small group of white guys, essentially, in those parties would select who would run for that position, that candidacy. All right, so that's not very democratic. Let the voters decide. Recall. Elected politicians can be removed from office. So what this means is, if a politician is doing something bad, I don't like my local legislator, myself, and a bunch of other voters can essentially, through a petition process, recall that politician to get them removed from office. Initiative. Us, the voters, can introduce laws. So what we can do is, let's say we want a law that says there should be a McDonald's in every street corner in America. That's our law we want to propose. We can take an initiative and essentially bring it to our legislator to enact or create that law. All right. Referendum. This is voters directly voting on a particular law. So, for example, let's say a referendum, I go to the voting polls, let's say I'm voting for a president and all the other local politicians, but at the very bottom of my ballot or on the back of my ballot, it asks me whether or not I approve the legalization of marijuana. I could say yes or no. That's the voters voting on a law, not the politicians up in Albany, okay, or Washington, D.C. So that's also very democratic. The 17th Amendment is going to be passed, okay, during this time period, saying that us, the voters, will directly elect our senators. We directly vote for them. Believe it or not, back in the day, us, the voters, did not select our senators. Again, they were chosen by the political parties. The main message to take away from all of these political reforms is that it gets us, the voters, way more involved. It's more democratic in this idea, in this process, than it was previously. All right, let's get to the man, the myth, the legend, Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is a guy with a lot of stuff to talk about him. He's got a great personal life, a very colorful life, I should say, a lot of different areas of interest, just a very interesting upbringing. He comes from a very prominent family, very rich family. He rises very quickly in his political career to become, obviously, president of the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about his life in next week's lecture about what happened before he was president. But he's always kind of been a man of the people, and he's always been kind of moved by seeing how others live, those who are less fortunate, those who don't have money, maybe those who are immigrants. He's always been this like champion of the people and definitely one for equality. Not maybe in the sense of civil rights equality, but in the sense of trying to make things equal or equal opportunities for as many people as possible. All right, to get rid of corruption, to get rid of big bad businesses taking advantage of the consumers, the people, the workers, etc. So, Teddy Roosevelt, he will become president once William McKinley is assassinated as president. He is shot, he's killed, and Teddy Roosevelt is now the new president. He, at the time, was the youngest president we've ever had thus far. And his vision for the presidency is a little bit different than anything we've ever seen before. And a lot of people are not going to like this, but also a lot of people are going to like this. So he believes in an enlarged role for the presidency, meaning he sees the government and the president getting more involved in people's everyday lives. We'll see what I mean by that coming up. To this point, the government has always been taking the side, when they do get involved, taking the side of big business. So, for example, Rutherford B. Hayes was president. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 happened, where the workers were going on strike at the railroad. Well, Hayes brought in troops to put down the strike because he was taking the side of the railroads, okay, and so the workers didn't get what they wanted. Grover Cleveland as president, something very similar. Okay, the Pullman strike uses federal troops again to put down this dispute with the railroads. Teddy Roosevelt comes along, and one of the biggest issues he has early on in his presidency is the coal mine strike in 1901 to 2. And what this does, or what happens is, coal is needed for fuel for to keep people to keep warm during the winter in particular, and he's got to end this dispute. So he actually is going to attempt to mediate the dispute between the laborers, the workers, and the coal miners, the owners of the industry. Now, the owners are not going to compromise. They don't want to give in to the workers. So Teddy Roosevelt actually threatens to take over the mines with the federal government's troops. And so they will eventually give in, and this ends the coal mine strike. And this is a huge shift in ideology as far as the government and their relationship with workers and big businesses. So this is just the first step of him getting involved. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's domestic policy is called the Square Deal. All right, it's got 3 C's, or 3 components to it. Now, the 3 C's, each of them beginning with C, obviously: corporations, consumers, and conservation. So the 3 areas of concern for him in his domestic reform are controlling the corporations, breaking up those trusts, the monopolies, helping us, the consumers, by passing laws to protect us, the buyers, and also something we've never really seen before on a national level is conservation of the environment and our resources. Okay, so this is Roosevelt's 3 C's. You definitely have to know the square deal on the 3 C's. I would know all 3, and we're going to try to put examples to all 3 of those C's coming up. So let's start with the first one, corporations. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt's going to be referred to as the trust-busting president. Trust, remember, is a monopoly, and he is going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to do just that. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act is not new. We talked about this a few weeks ago. The Sherman Antitrust Act, though, was never actually used for what its intended purpose was. The Sherman Antitrust Act was kind of powerless for a little while, for about 13 years, until good old TR comes along and will use it to break up the first railroad monopoly, the Northern Securities Company, in 1904. This is a big deal. Remember, the railroads were America's first major monopoly. Now, Roosevelt doesn't want to get rid of every single monopoly. He does see a difference between good and bad trust is what he sees. So believe it or not, he's actually, although we refer to him as being the trust-busting president, he's actually not going to make or break up the most trusts, okay? That will be Taft. All right, we'll see that coming up. Teddy Roosevelt also seeks to increase the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Again, that also has been around. We talked about that a couple weeks ago as well. Because he wants government control, greater government control of interstate commerce, and that's something, again, the populists, the farmers, have been wanting for a long time. A couple of other things, side notes, okay, the Elkins Act increased penalties for rate rebates. Remember, that was an issue with the farmers, okay, the Grangers. And the Hepburn Act in 1906 gives the Interstate Commerce Commission power to set maximum rates for railroads. So he's saying, hey, listen, the railroads can't charge past this amount. Okay, so that's a big deal. The next C is the consumer protections. Okay, he is going to pass a couple of laws in response to a particular book that we talked about last week in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. So The Jungle, my apologies for the bell, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, if you remember to last week, was focusing on the meatpacking industry, okay, the horrors, the bad stuff going on in the meatpacking industry. And Teddy Roosevelt comes along and, in response to that, passes the Meat Inspection Act, which, like I said last week, is self-explanatory. The government comes in and inspects their meat. The FDA is created in 1906 as well, where the government comes and basically has this agency that inspects all products that we eat. So everything we eat has a nutrition label, or it should, at least, I should say. If you're eating stuff that doesn't have a nutrition label and is not FDA approved, probably not a good idea. That what the FDA is doing is saying, hey, listen, this product is safe, it's good to eat, it doesn't have someone's fingernails or chopped off finger inside of it, so it's good to eat, here are the nutrition facts, you're good to go. All right, so again, everything we buy from the grocery store should have this. If it doesn't, well, you probably shouldn't be eating it. All right. So that's something else Teddy Roosevelt is credited with doing. Okay, so the last C of his square deal was conservation. And like I said before, we've never seen this on a national level, but we were introduced to the Sierra Club and John Muir a week or two ago in our reading. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, he's a big outdoorsman. He's got many reasons to love the outdoors. As a kid, he was plagued with asthma, and his father said, "Listen, the way we're going to get over this is I'm going to throw your butt outside for a couple hours each day." Fresh air, it did help him. And he was able to kind of combat the asthma that he had, and this made him fall in love with the outdoors. He was very big into animals and plants. He also will come to love water, and he actually will, before he becomes president, become Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He um, is also going to love physical fitness as well. So he's a big believer in hiking and boxing and football actually. So the outdoors are just something he's always loved since he was a little kid, and nature has always fascinated him. So when he becomes president, he is going to make sure that we put aside land specifically to conserve for the environment. All right, and so his Forest Reserve Act of 1891, that was to put aside land for the federal government. He's going to build on top of that in the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902. So the money from sale of the public lands can be used for irrigation projects in the West. What he's trying to do there is basically, set up effectively out west where it's dry and arid. So Las Vegas actually is some place that is going to be in desperate need of water, and there's no way that we would have Las Vegas today without some of the irrigation projects from this time from Teddy Roosevelt if it weren't for getting water out to the desert. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, he is our first major conservationist. He's not our last, okay, but it's a very unique, very different thing. We've never seen this before. Well, Teddy Roosevelt spends 2 terms as president, almost 2 full terms. There was no law against him running again, but he is going to follow Washington's precedent, and he steps down after 2 terms. He gives over the presidency to his boy Taft, William Taft, who was his vice president. And Taft seems like things are just going to continue from the Roosevelt era, where he is also going to take on big business and break up more trusts. Now Taft was a pretty big dude, as you can see in that picture there. The picture at the bottom of the slide, there was a lot of people poke fun at his size, and his bathtub, you can see there, holds 4 grown men inside. So he was a pretty big dude. He's definitely our largest president we've ever had. Now, interesting thing is Taft, which I kind of mentioned earlier, he's actually going to break up more trusts than Roosevelt. So although we associate Roosevelt as being the trust-busting president, Taft actually breaks up more trusts. Taft's foreign policy, which you're going to find pop up in, I'm not sure if it's next week or in 2 weeks, reading, is dollar diplomacy. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Roosevelt's foreign policy next week, but to contrast with Taft's policy of dollar diplomacy, Taft was all about trying to use American businesses in Latin America to kind of take control, economic control, that is, of countries. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about this next week, okay, as far as foreign policies. Really just concerned in this chapter about domestic policies. Now, Taft only spends 1 term in office. He is going to run again, and him and Roosevelt have a little bit of a falling out, and Roosevelt's not happy with Taft's policies, especially when it comes to conservation. And Roosevelt is actually going to say, you know what, Taft, you should really step down and let me become president again. And Taft says, absolutely not. I'm going to run for re-election. So Roosevelt says, okay, well, I'm going to run against you. And Teddy Roosevelt runs again in the 1912 election. Although he's not allowed to run as the Republican candidate, he's going to say, okay, I'm just going to make up my own party. We'll call that the Old Moose Party. Okay, so the Republicans were very divided going to this election of 1912. You had Taft, the incumbent. Incumbent means the person who's sitting in office. And then you had the almighty Teddy Roosevelt. All right, everybody loved Roosevelt. So very hard for the Republicans to decide, and so they choose Taft to represent them. Now, the two of them, because their party was really divided between the two of them, that's not going to fare very well for them. And they're both going to run against a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is going to be the winner of that election. And we'll see some of his policies coming up. Now, Taft, what are some other things that he has done that's going to lead him maybe to anger some people in his party and the progressives? He's going to raise tariffs, which we haven't seen in some time. The tariffs were very high in the Gilded Age. They came down during the McKinley and Roosevelt eras, and now he raises them again. That's going to anger a lot of people. He's going to, like I said, anger Roosevelt by firing the chief of Forest Service, Pinot, after a little scandal here. And so that's going to lose a lot of Roosevelt supporters. So the main story is here, historically speaking, when a party is divided over something, they're not going to win. Okay, we've seen it before with the Whigs and slavery. We're going to see it obviously here in 1912. All right, and throughout history, time and time again, we'll try to point out other examples come up. So here you go. Here's the election of 1912. Here's your major candidates. We've already mentioned Teddy Roosevelt running under his own political party called the Bull Moose Party. He just makes it up essentially. He says, okay, the Republicans don't want me. Obviously, the Democrats don't. I make up my own. And so we already kind of know what Teddy Roosevelt's all about. He just wants to continue his progressive policies and break up trusts, etc. We already know what Taft is about. All right, Taft is just same thing. He wants to continue his policies, high tariffs, break up trusts. But then Woodrow Wilson comes along, and Woodrow Wilson is the Democrat, and he is going to run off a very progressive platform called the New Freedom. Now, his New Freedom, his domestic reform ideas include lowering tariffs, reforming the banking industry, which we're going to find out what that means a little bit more during his presidency coming up. And he also wants to continue breaking up trusts. So he's got a lot of good qualities there in this New Freedom platform, and that's really why he's going to win. Okay, he's got a lot of good ideas from both parties, and he's going to, follow through on them exactly. There is a fourth candidate, a socialist candidate, Eugene Debs. Yeah, that's right. There was a socialist who actually ran for president. Eugene Debs ran quite a few times, and obviously not successful, but he is going to run under the ideas that the government wasn't doing enough reform. They weren't getting involved enough, that there should be more government ownership of railroads and steel and oil companies, etc. But nonetheless, okay, the winning candidate is Woodrow Wilson, and we'll see a little bit more about his policies coming up in these next few weeks. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of Wilson's reforms in the various areas that he promised. Tariff reform, under the Underwood tariff, he's going to lower tariffs to the lowest they've been in 50 years. So this is a big deal. Remember, a lot of people don't like tariffs, especially farmers, especially Southerners, Westerners. They don't like tariffs. As far as trusts, he's going to continue to break up trusts with the Federal Trade Commission, trying to investigate monopolies and break them up. The Clayton Antitrust Act he helps get passed in 1914. Now, the Clayton Antitrust Act basically just increased the power of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which again was used to break up monopolies. So, Taft and Wilson are actually going to break up more monopolies than Roosevelt, as previously mentioned. As far as banking reform, this is kind of new. We haven't talked about this, but the populists really wanted some of these things. Wilson is going to pass the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, which is still around today. The Federal Reserve is responsible for coining our money and also setting interest rates. We haven't really seen a national bank. This is basically a new version of the national bank. We haven't seen this since the Andrew Jackson era. Remember, Andrew Jackson got rid of it in 1836, and we haven't seen the national bank around since. So this is a very big deal. The Federal Reserve, like I said, is still around today. They set interest rates and loans and also coin our money. They also, Wilson also is going to help pass and be in support of the 16th Amendment, which we've alluded to a few times. And again, this was something supported by populists, the Grangers, and this is a graduated income tax. As I mentioned earlier, the more money you make, the more money the government takes, all right, which is obviously still around today and still in effect. As far as the progressive movement when it comes to African American civil rights, if you want to talk about a failure of the progressive era, this is it. Okay, there really was not a specific reform for African Americans in civil rights, which is a shame, obviously. We didn't talk about anything about civil rights in these past 2 weeks because there really wasn't any major reforms. Right, African Americans are still living under the Jim Crow era. You see limitations on voting and disenfranchisement of their rights. You see a lot of African Americans being ignored by this movement, and you still see segregation in place. All right, so Plessy versus Ferguson, that case that said, segregation is legal, is still around. So the failure of the progressive movement, probably the biggest failure is civil rights. Okay, unfortunately. Although the progressive era does not produce any specific reforms for African Americans, there are two leaders in civil rights during this time, Booker T. Washington and Webb Du Bois. We've kind of introduced them already in the past, but definitely be aware of them. Be aware, like I said in the past, of their similar goal that they both want equal rights for African Americans. They just go about it at different ways. Booker T. Washington, who was a former slave, says, listen, this is going to take time. All right, it's going to take quite a few generations to become equal. And so he advocated for African Americans to obtain vocational jobs, basic jobs, instead of going to become the next president right away. Okay, it's going to take time, a few generations. Now, Du Bois says, absolutely not. I do not like this gradual approach that Booker T. Washington is approaching. He demands an immediate approach to equality. And so that's what makes them really different. Okay, besides their, individual accolades, if you will, of what they helped create or establish or found, okay, that's their biggest difference. Okay, that's what you really need to know. On the bottom there, don't forget about Ida B. Wells, who is also in your reading, and a couple of questions in your homework. Very important. Ida B. Wells in trying to bring attention to the anti-lynching, to the anti-lynching campaign in the sense that a lot of African Americans were being lynched. And, if you don't know what that means to be lynched, it's essentially, being hung and sometimes even lit on fire. This is a hate crime, obviously, as well. And there are some pictures in your textbook as far as what it looks like. And you obviously can look this up online as well. But be prepared for graphic images because it's very sad. So Ida B. Wells was trying to bring attention to lynching in our country. Also an advocate for women's suffrage, as we'll see, the progressive era will also fight for, and it will culminate after World War I, so we will talk more about that, and civil rights as well. Okay? Women in the progressive era, this is a repeat as well. We've mentioned this 2 weeks ago. Carrie Chapman Catt. Chapman Catt, that is president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, also along with Alice Paul, both fighting for women's suffrage. They will eventually get it in the 19th Amendment, but that's not until after World War I. We'll see why that is later on. Alice Paul will break with this party because she's more of a militant person. She's like your English, like the American version of the English suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst, okay, if you remember back to last year. And just to recap, okay, here's your progressive presidents. I would definitely know their policies, at least some of their policies, Teddy Roosevelt being the biggest one. The exam loves to bring him up as far as the progressive era, and Woodrow Wilson as well. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about their policies in the next few weeks as well when it comes to foreign policy. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. Hopefully this helped you. If you felt this gave you some good knowledge and you got something out of it, please feel free to give me a like or subscribe. Other than that, peace out till next time.